BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Alright, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, and on Wednesdays this year I've been doing a regular segment about the Phantom Killer, an unidentified serial killer who operated in Texarkana in 1946. This episode will focus on the Phantom Killer's second attack on Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, and this one is really quite different from the first attack on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae, and in case you did not hear that segment in the Phantom Killer saga, I just want to share some basic info. The first one is that both Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae survived the attack, and they were able to provide this witness description of somebody wearing a hooded mask, almost like a pillowcase or a sack over his head, attacked them and sexually assaulted Mary Jean LeRae, and this was on February 22nd of 1946. Almost a month, if not more than a month later, into March 24th of 1946, going from February 22nd to March 24th. February has only 28 days. That's why I said about almost a month or more than a month. It depends on how you look at it. But this is a rather substantial gap compared to some of the Phantom Killer's other activities. But Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore are gunned down. They are both inside of a car. And this is quite different than the first one because Jimmy Hollis was beaten with the gun, but he was not shot. Mary Jean LeRae was sexually assaulted, and Polly Ann Moore was not. And I've been reading the book, The Phantom Killer, Unlocking the Mystery of Texarkana's Serial Murders, the story of a town in terror by James Presley, and some of the info that has been shared about Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore is that somebody stumbled upon their car and simply thought that it was something quite to the contrary. They didn't believe that they were murdered, but then it turned out there was an enormous amount of blood. I mean, even going down the doors and onto the floorboards of the car, to the point where they theorized that the killer must have had an enormous amount of blood on them. And one of the early theories about this is that it was actually a murder-suicide, that one of the victims had been the killer. But that was easily dismissed by the medical examiners because both Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were shot in the back of the head. And, I mean, without the firearm present, that should also have been the bigger clue, even if they were shot somewhere else. I think a murder-suicide would beg the question about, well, where was the firearm and such. But, people did ask questions, so they began to get a certain sense of curiosity, and all the facts wouldn't have been presented to someone who was just hearing the story for the first time, so I can see that both ways. But yes, indeed, this was a murder. And what I begin to notice is that there's a very particular detail in James Presley's book here, The Phantom Killer, about Polly Ann Moore, and that is that she was not sexually assaulted, and Mary Jean LeRae was. And I've been trying to be very gentle with my words because I don't even like discussing the subject, but Mary Jean LeRae was actually sexually assaulted with the gun barrel, and Polly Ann Moore was not. Not only that, though, James Pressly points out that she was wearing a sanitary pad at the time, like a sanitary napkin. So she was on her menstrual cycle. And could this have been something that would have turned off the sexual predator? Did he just not want to approach her in that way, the way that the Phantom Killer had done to Mary Jean LeRae? My honest answer to that question is no. I don't think that would have turned off the killer. And that is a total instinct. That is an instinctive response. I certainly don't know what the killer was thinking, but in the previous episodes, I've stated that I think the differences between the attack on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae and the attack on Griffin and Moore suggest that there could be a possibility that there were two different people involved, that these are two different attackers. Now, I don't know that 100%, but that's what my immediate interpretation of these findings is. And the reason why I don't think the sanitary pad would have turned off the killer was the intention was so vicious. And if the killer was so easily capable of committing murder, I don't think he would have been turned off by menstrual blood if his intention had been indeed to sexually assault Polly Ann Moore. And some background info on her is actually, or on the crime that is that Richard Griffin had identification on him, but Polly Ann Moore did not. And she was firstly identified because she was wearing a class ring that had the initials PAM for Polly Ann Moore, and that ring helped identify her. The family identified that ring. But Richard Griffin's pockets were turned inside out, and the way that James Pressly describes them finding his body is that Richard Griffin's body is in the car, almost in the exact center, like even in between the front seat and the passenger seat, and the pockets of his pants have been turned inside out. That is something that looks like a robbery. Now, this goes in the opposite direction, calling every piece of evidence the way we see it, the way I see it even. The attacker on Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore was not Richard Griffin, the attacker on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae. The first one was quite possibly a botched robbery gone wrong, and the second one also seems like there's a high chance that it was financially motivated. What I said about the Hollis LeRae attack was, it seemed like a deranged madman, but also someone who had the awareness to steal things. If he wants to rob Jimmy Hollis, and if he can have access to Mary Jean LeRae for sexual reasons, okay, then he's going to do that too, or in a different order, that this is a criminal deviant and a sexual deviant. So the criminal deviant part is there for the second attack on Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, but what I'm not seeing is the type of sexual component. And I would like to present the theory again one more time, or even you could call it my hypothesis rather, that the attacker on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae was a different person. One person committed the Phantom Killer's second two attacks on Richard Griffin, Polly Ann Moore, Betty Jo Booker, and Paul Martin, and there was a different killer altogether for the final murder, the murder of Virgil Starks. So, again, I think the evidence that would support that is the differences in the crimes, the different types of weapons that are used, as well as the lack of sexual motivation to kill and to commit sexual assault. I mean, I think the Phantom Killers, plural, would have all been somewhat sexually motivated. The way that Dr. Todd Grande talked about David Berkowitz, the son of Sam shooter, that they were sexually motivated crimes, even though there wasn't a large amount of physical contact. So that's something that I think is very important to add into the mix. Yeah, the killer's probably getting some type of sexual release from committing this crime, but not all of the victims are involved with intense sexual contact. And it really is absolutely very saddening to hear about this, and rest in peace to Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. But I said that I would call every piece of evidence as I read into it And this attack, though, also appears to have been the work of a deranged madman who had conscious awareness, someone who had the awareness to go through Richard Griffin's pockets at all. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, that's not a complicated thing. Oh, yes, indeed. I mean, it shows that someone is thinking in somewhat of a clear, coherent, and cogent way, as opposed to someone who might be experiencing a psychotic episode and would not be able to demonstrate any real logic. That is consistent with the behavior of the first attacker, or my assessment of the first attacker, that there is a person who is deranged, mentally ill, but still the smallest bit calculating, completely aware of what he is doing. He's just very destructive and also very chaotic with his choices. Right now, I would like to read something from the book The Phantom Killer by James Presley, talking about the deaths of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. Couple found, shot to death, in auto. Accompanying the article were photographs of the two victims, a studio photo of the handsome Griffin and a snapshot of smiling Polly Moore with her black and white dog on the front steps of her home while she was in high school. The photo had been found in her purse next to her body. A justice of the peace executed the death certificates, assessing that the cause of death was a gunshot in the base of the skull. At work Monday morning, Byron Brower Jr. noticed that Polly Moore, with whom he had been working as she checked the ammunition trucks, hadn't shown up. He hadn't read the papers yet. Others began talking about the murders, and then he realized that the young woman's body he had seen in the car the morning was that of Polly. He hadn't been close enough to recognize her. This is a witness, that is. Polly's services were held at the Pleasant Hill Baptist Church Monday afternoon in the little community of Bryan's Mill, with burial in the cemetery nearby, where she had been born 17 years before. It was late Monday afternoon when the police notified Wellborn Griffin that his brother's body had been released. He called the funeral home and said that two men accompanied him to the police station to acquire the release. When they arrived, they learned of the change of plans. As for the investigation into the case, the evidence was sparse. The bullets taken from Richard Griffin's head and the holes of the bullets, and possibly, or possibly not, fingerprints from the dead man's car, were the only tangible clues. The bullets that killed Polly Ann Moore had not been removed, and had been buried with her body. It was assumed that the same weapon had killed her as killed Griffin. The cartridge shells seemed to come from the same gun. If the bullets were needed later, the body could be exhumed. And again, sharing my immediate instinct, as it states very clearly, if she had been buried before they examined what type of bullets had been used, then how do we truly know it was the same firearm? I believe it was the same firearm. I'm being very clear, and I'm going to state that again. My first instinct tells me, yes, indeed, it was the same firearm. The same person murdered Richard Griffin, who murdered Polly Ann Moore, and there's a very good reason for this. They say that only one type of shell was left behind, and some of you are probably thinking, well, what if there was a second killer who had a revolver, and it's actually this type of tag team duo committing the phantom crimes? Well, in both instances where there were surviving victims, the attack on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae, as well as the murder of Virgil Starks, no one seemed to report any encounters with a second perpetrator, so that suggests that there's one person going out at a time, and furthermore, only one type of shell is left behind at the murder of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. Well, that also suggests that there is a single perpetrator, or at the very least there is only one shooter for each crime. And back to the segment in the book. The cartridge shells seemed to have come from the same gun. If the bullets were needed later, the body could be exhumed. If any witnesses existed, it would take an energetic and lucky individual to dig and identify and locate them. Although lawmen recognized the case was exceptional, residents appeared not overly upset or fearful. The vicious attack on Mary Jean LeRae and Jimmy Hollis the month before had faded from most people's memory. And as I pointed out, it was 4 weeks, and the Phantom Killer will then operate in the middle of April, and then once again at the beginning of May. The Phantom Killer's crime spree was only for 10 weeks, so it's possible that there's this alternative theory that these were just unconnected crimes that the media stitched together because Texarkana wasn't used to having a lot of serial killer activity. So when there were 4 crimes that took place, everybody, and I mean everybody, immediately assumed that they were all the same person. The morning after his Monday night arrival, Ranger Gear retraced the investigation up to the point going over the clues and presented a new theory, and driving to the murder scene where the bodies and Griffin's car had been found, searching for any clues that might have been overlooked. 2 days after the crime, it was futile. The milling throng, following on the heels of rain, fatally complicated the officer's work. And that I totally understand. So, it seems like in a lot of these unsolved true crime cases, either the victim, or sorry, not the victims, either the killer gets extremely lucky, or there is genuine interference in the investigation, or even the investigators make critical errors. But in this case, that just sounds like somebody getting lucky, that rain destroyed a lot of the evidence. And I'm reminded of the Swindle murders in 1964, the murders of Johnny Ray and Joyce Swindle, which were thought to have been committed by the Zodiac Killer, but 2 people were murdered, and the media came in and started doing their reporting, but unknowingly trampled the crime scene and destroyed any possibility of collecting footprints. And with the Phantom Killer case, I think that they're saying something similar, except it's not exactly caused by human error, is that they want to investigate these outdoor scenes where there's a car at a lover's lane and the rain came in, the rainfall destroyed a lot of the evidence that could have been left behind. Bullets were extracted from Richard Griffin's body. The murder weapon was a .32 automatic pistol with 6 lands and grooves with a left-hand twist, and it was determined to be a Colt or a similar foreign make. Although veterans had brought back any number of foreign-made guns as souvenirs from the recent war, most likely the gun was American and therefore a Colt. A Colt? I said cult. I meant cold. Yes, but I think that it's also important to note that the weapon that was stated here was a .32 caliber automatic pistol. When I was reading the biography on Lone Wolf Gonzalez, which I discussed in part 1 of this series, it stated that it was a .38, but the caliber is very important because the second and third attacks will have the same type of gun caliber, and the final attack will have a different one. That will be a .22. The evidence was assigned to be maintained for comparison with any other pistol or bullets that might turn up. You see, though, there's so much evidence in the Phantom Killer case, and it's quite similar to the Zodiac mystery, but they might actually have clearer samples of the Phantom Killer's fingerprints and palm print. This did not mean that there would be a definite tie into just any .32 caliber Colt automatic that officers might find. It would have to be test fire to confirm the fit. It was not an uncommon weapon, but was relatively a small handgun that could be readily concealed and used very easily. Although investigators found no murder weapon after scouring the brush and the surrounding area, coincidentally, more than 3 years later, several girls found a pistol a quarter-mile from the crime scene. In October of 1949, 10-year-old Marie Barlow and girls her age were playing in the open field about 5 acres with tall, knee-deep grass when they happened upon a strange, rusted, dirt-clogged pistol. They reported it to an adult who passed it on to the authorities. Was it linked to the 1946 murders? Well, I don't think that would be immediately true, because this is the early section of the book and we aren't at the third attack yet, but as I said, from looking into this case in the past, the big revelation will be that the same firearm is used. But I talked about how Bronson Mulch, author of the biography of Lone Wolf Gonzalez, said that the victims were killed with a .38 as opposed to a .32. This is actually addressed here in this section, saying that the Texas Ranger, Stuart Stanley, dashed any speculation. it was a .38 caliber Spanish-made revolver that was found by the girls in the field, as opposed to an automatic pistol, and the gun that was found was the .38, and that was a six-shooter, not an automatic, and it was a different caliber. Lawmen periodically found discarded weapons. Whatever the explanation would be, it did not fit this murder case. And I agree completely. I mean, I bet a lot of you are wondering, if the motive to commit the crime on Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore was not sexual, other than, as we said, some indirect way, why did it happen? And this is addressed by James Presley when he says that, firstly, it's very puzzling, but is it possible that it was a robbery gone wrong? Or maybe a different one would be that, is it possible that it was a murder that was planned, premeditated, cold, methodical, and calculating, but the pockets of Richard Griffin's pants were pulled inside out to confuse the authorities? And at this point, I think all of those make sense. And even if it's someone who's trying to commit crimes, but the whole concept of confusing the authorities so the killer knows the truth and nobody else will figure it out. I mean, I can see all of these as possibilities. But what do you think about the story of the Phantom Killer and the murders of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore? Do you think there is something significant in the fact that the victim was not sexually assaulted, and that suggests that there are different perpetrators in these crimes? Or do you think that it's all the same killer, and he's just acting in some type of deranged way because he is doing things that fuel his own dopamine surges from unconventional behavior? What do you think? And also, I would like to know what you think about this story of the Phantom Killer carrying different firearms. Was he just a guy who owned more than one gun, or was this a different person? And also, which crimes do you think would have been committed by the Phantom Killer? And an interesting note about that is that Virgil Starks is really the only person who is substantially older. I mean, he's in his late 30s, and there are victims in their 20s for the Phantom Killer, but they aren't quite as old as Virgil Starks. I think that is so similar to the Zodiac Killer's method of choosing victims, and with Paul Stine, the taxi driver, being the oldest, 7 years age gap from the youngest victim, and the other victims are like 16, 17, 19, 22, 20 years old, so definitely younger, and then the final victim is older. I think that there are just so many answers in the Phantom Killer case that we'll also share with the Zodiac case. But thank you so much for listening to this episode, and anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there's always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.